All right, welcome back to our live stream here on Dropsite News. As always, we rely on supporters to be able to produce the journalism that we do. If you can become one of those supporters, we are a nonprofit. You can find us over at dropsitenews.com. If you're not signed up for our newsletter, please head over there. That's free. Our journalism will always remain free. We're able to do that thanks to the support of people who voluntarily decide to either donate or upgrade to a paid subscription. So over the weekend, Hamas in the United States reached an understanding as to a short-term ceasefire. Immediately, Israeli officials came out and insisted that they will have nothing to do with this ceasefire. Our team at Dropsite, led by Jeremy over the weekend, was reporting incrementally on our Twitter feed or Blue Sky elsewhere, as well as a piece that they put up. And let me put this one up here on Monday that is worth a read to give you kind of the details and the ins and outs of how this understanding came together and then was pulled apart, although it remains kind of a live contest between the three different parties. So today's live stream is going to be shorter than our typical one, but I did want to get Jeremy on here to walk through where this came from, how it came together, what the terms were, and then also where we might be headed going forward. Because even though Israel has immediately rejected it, that doesn't mean that this effort is over. So Jeremy, how are you this morning?
I mean, I spent the morning looking at the images out of Gaza, and it just feels like every single day we're just watching children being burned alive. I mean, it's
yes, it feels, and for people who've been either living this or following it, it can always feel like it can't get worse, and then yet Israel has found ways to, in the last several weeks, in particular, to make things worse. Before we get into the deal, let's very briefly, can you give us an update on this humanitarian aid situation with this Swiss-based weirdo Marine who was running this thing connected to the Israelis, that now it's even too much for him apparently, and nothing apparently is getting in?
Yeah, I mean, let's remember that there is a decades-long program that was in place and administered by the United Nations that was the primary distributor of aid to Palestinians that have been displaced or forcibly removed from their land or their homes, going back to the origins of the Nakba, the catastrophe that followed the imposition of an apartheid colonial state on Palestinian land. And much of that is coordinated by UNRWA. And Israel has been waging its own war to try to destroy UNRWA, not just because Israel wants to control the amount of calories that Palestinians in Gaza are able to take into their bodies, but also because UNRWA represents the right of return of the Palestinian people. And so the United States and Israel in recent months, the Trump administration and Netanyahu, came up with an idea that I think was, originally born of, out of Netanyahu's thought process on his war of annihilation against the Palestinians, where they would essentially dismantle UNRWA's presence in Palestine and create a semi-non-governmental organization called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that's registered in Switzerland and has ties, some of its personnel have ties to the CIA in terms of the private security that's being attached to it. So basically what it is that Israel is going to be quote unquote securing zones where this so-called non-governmental organization is going to distribute really small boxes. We've now started to see the images coming out of Gaza, really small boxes that have a couple of bags of pasta, some lentils, and some other items in them. And people have to walk, in some cases, 15 or 20 kilometers to go and get this aid. And there's already images of people lined up, and it was haphazardly put together. And as we were preparing to come on today, Iyad Amawi, who is from the Gaza relief committees, texted me and with an urgent appeal saying that a Palestinian man who actually was among the first to arrive to try to get a box of aid this morning was kidnapped by Israeli forces when he went to go and get the aid. This is one of the nightmare scenarios that Palestinians and others have been warning about, that Israel would try to use the distribution of aid to lure people from central and northern Gaza into the south of Gaza, and then either try to force them to stay in the area or to use it as a mechanism to snatch more Palestinians. And I just want to read you briefly what his family says happens at the Morai Crossing Aid Distribution Center. He said, quote, this is a statement from this man's family. To our shock, he called us under threat from Israeli intelligence officers demanding information about one of our relatives with whom we've had no contact since the beginning of the war. When we were unable to provide the information the army requested, communication was cut off, and we were later informed that he was transferred to a detention center. He's now considered missing. Iyad gave us a statement this morning in general about how, and he's one of the people on the Gaza Relief Committees helping to coordinate the work of NGOs that have long worked inside of Gaza. And I think it's worth just sharing this with people, his description of what is happening right now. He said, what's happening with the American organization operating under the protection of the Israeli military is the following. They announced the existence of a warehouse in the Tel al-Satan area west of Rafah city. Dozens of civilians voluntarily headed there without any organized distribution system to receive a food parcel, as you may have seen in some of the circulated photos. The process does not follow any regulated distribution mechanism like those previously managed by UN agencies. It's merely a demonstration, a way to claim that aid distribution has resumed. The minimum distance a person must walk to receive a food parcel that barely lasts 2 days is more than 15 kilometers. There's no public transportation. Only basic local tools like donkey-drawn carts can sometimes reach the area. A humanitarian appeal, which we have verified, was issued by a family whose relative was detained during the distribution due to the military's presence nearby. The situation constitutes humiliation and degradation of the Palestinian citizen. The current procedures, Ayad writes, resemble a ghetto, with people forced to enter through detour routes to receive aid in a degrading manner, and again with no system in place. This is ineffective and fails to reach large segments of the population. We're talking about tens of thousands across the Gaza Strip who will not be able to access these aid points. A single distribution location in Rafah, in the heart of a military incursion zone, poses significant danger and threat. It will not be effective unless aid distribution is returned to a system managed by UN-affiliated institutions, ensuring neutrality, fairness, and inclusivity in the process. That statement just released this morning by one of the main officials in Gaza who's been responsible for coordinating this aid. And we've seen condemnations of this program coming from the highest levels of the United Nations. Now you have even countries that have been major facilitators of Israel's genocide. I'm thinking, of the European countries recently, the United Kingdom, France, but also this week, Germany. Even though Germany has been just bloodthirsty genocidal in support of Israel, the incoming or the new chancellor, Friedrich Merz, said this week, well, it seems like in recent days, things have gotten really bad and we don't see a justification to be doing this in the name of fighting Hamas. So when you even are starting to lose Germany, which has been as enthusiastic as the United States in adopting Israel's lie-filled narrative to justify a war of annihilation, then it's clear how startling and horrifying the situation has become. So, you and I have talked about this, Ryan, before, about this aid program, and I likened it to essentially setting a trap. The Israelis dehumanize Palestinians. They talk about them as animals, and it's essentially saying, we're going to put bait inside of this cage. When you go into it, we're going to shut it, and we're either going to kill you inside of there, or we're going to implement what Netanyahu calls Trump's plan, which is we're going to remove you entirely from your land and send you somewhere else, whether it's Libya or Somaliland or elsewhere. So very dire situation. There are thousands of Palestinian children at risk of starvation, and that is spreading rapidly by the hour if you talk to doctors and health officials on the ground.
It sounds like the situation that you're describing with the kidnapped Palestinian man requires a sophisticated and premeditated plan. So, in other words, like a man arrived at this distribution center. They must have asked for ID, so they identify who the man is, punch his name into whatever laptop they have there. Something pops up that it sounds like, reading between the lines here from the conversation, that there's somebody in a family connected to him or something who Israel has some suspicions about. Not that they have suspicions about him, not that they have suspicions about anybody even close to him, but there's some multiple degrees separation to somebody they suspect. Let's say I would assume a fighter, but could be something else. And so then they detain him, threaten him to try to leverage, blackmail, extort the family to give information about this person who they say they haven't seen since the very beginning of this conflict. They fail at that, and they just chain him and haul him off. Like that has to be, as far as I understand it, a top-down system. Like this could not be just pulled off by guards just operating ad hoc.
No, I mean, I think that's, we only know the facts that I presented,
right.
But just, based on what we know about Israel's operating procedures, they have extensive biographical information about every Palestinian. They have massive repositories filled with data. They are listening in on, or at a minimum, recording for future listening, every form of communication in and out of Gaza, the occupied West Bank, occupied East Jerusalem. And one of the things that we learned early on from leaked draft documents about this program was that they were going to be using biometric data scanning, that they were going to be doing not just quote unquote security vetting, but also political vetting. So I would imagine that Israel is also viewing this as an intelligence gathering operation, akin to also how the United States operated in the post 9/11 environment, where you would find someone whose data trail is 2 or 3 hops away from someone that you suspect might be connected to this organization, and you snatch that person. And both the United States and Israel have engaged in torture of people that have no direct connection whatsoever to the actual groups that they're supposedly trying to destroy or go to war against, but the mere fact that there's some data linking them to it. So it's totally plausible that they snatched this guy, that his data was connected to someone else's data, was connected to someone else's data in their family, and they're going to hold him and interrogate him. And maybe he makes it out, maybe he doesn't. Maybe he's tortured, maybe he's put into administrative detention. Maybe they're going to start taking more people to exchange in captive exchange deals going forward in this ceasefire process. But even mainstream humanitarian organizations and people like Cindy McCain, whose late husband John McCain was one of the most diehard Zionist supporters of Israel's entire project. She's interviewed on the Sunday talk shows and is confronted with, well, Hamas is stealing the aid, and she pushes back and says no. So when you've lost Cindy McCain, John McCain's widow, in your propaganda narrative, that it is propaganda. That it's a lie. So I think this is some sense that what we're witnessing is going to fulfill some of the greatest fears of people when this was first announced, that it is going to be a paltry amount of so-called aid, that people are going to have to risk their lives to go and get it, that they may be part of a program where they're trying to force them to leave permanently central and northern Gaza with the hopes that they can get some food, and that it's going to be viewed as an intelligence operation to snatch and kidnap Palestinians for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. So let's talk about the ceasefire, quote unquote, understanding that Hamas believed it had come to with the United States over the weekend. How did that come together? What were the general terms that they believed that they had agreed to?
I mean, this is a really kind of strange path to negotiation that the Trump administration has undertaken. I mean, it's certainly interesting. And basically, here's the story. As I think by now, most people, certainly people that read DropSite, are aware of who Steve Witkoff is. He's one of Trump's golf buddies. He's a billionaire real estate investor, a personal friend of Trump's. Hasn't really been involved at all in organized politics or government diplomacy. He's sort of Trump's top envoy. Then there was Adam Bowler, who is the special envoy on hostages and the official we've talked about a lot, who did the direct talks with Hamas back in February. Well, in recent weeks, or the past, let's say, month and a half, another figure has emerged as a kind of backdoor negotiator for the Trump administration. And he's a guy named Bashara Baba, who is the head of Arab Americans for Trump. And people may remember him from the campaign trail when Trump was kind of trying to hit Kamala Harris, coming, with criticism of her warmongering policies, and Trump was sort of saying he was going to be the man that would bring peace to the Middle East. So Bashar al-Baba has been engaged in direct talks with Hamas, and my understanding is that he was the American official that was directly dealing with Hamas when they negotiated the release of Idan Alexander, the Israeli soldier with American citizenship who was freed by Hamas a couple of weeks ago. And what's happened in the past couple of weeks is that Trump, since he went to the Gulf and met with the leaders of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, our sources tell us that Qatar in particular put a lot of pressure on Trump to lift Israel's siege blockade, which has been in effect almost 3 months now, no food, no medicine, no fuel going in, and that Trump gave them assurances that he had given Israel 2 months to essentially continue burning Gaza and its people to the ground, and now he was ready to sort of move toward wrapping it up. So Bashar al-Baba is sitting with Hamas officials, and they basically go through terms on the sheet that Steve Witkoff had put before Hamas back in late March. And they said, if you can meet these terms, then I think we can get Israel to agree to it. This is what Hamas was told. So late Sunday night, they're going through the details. They're looking at an Arabic language document. And Hamas and Trump's envoy hit a point where the U.S. representative in the room is saying, if you accept these terms, this is acceptable to the United States, and now we're going to go to Israel with this. So Hamas then, the reason that they say they reached an understanding is because there isn't a document that's signed. Yes, there's a piece of paper, and DropSite has seen that piece of paper. It lays out 13 terms for what would at the beginning be a 60-day temporary ceasefire. And during that period, on day one, Hamas and the other resistance groups would release 5 living Israeli captives, and they would then release another 5 living Israeli captives at the end of that 60-day period. And in the middle of that, they would also return to Israel 16 bodies of captives who are dead, either those who died in Gaza and their bodies were taken back or died in captivity inside of Gaza. But crucially, from Hamas's perspective, it contained a number of guarantees. Remember, the only currency that Hamas has in its dealings with Israel right now is those captives. 58 of them living and dead are believed to still be in Gaza. They feel they got burned on the Idan Alexander deal because they got no Palestinians released, and Trump didn't even make good on Witkoff's pledge that they would lift the siege and Trump would call for a ceasefire. So Hamas has really been pushing the Americans and the regional negotiators. How can we trust that if you tell us we have a deal, that the deal will be respected, because Israel has a PhD in violating any agreement it signs with Palestinians, particularly ceasefire agreements? So what it included were American guarantees that as long as there were no military operations emanating from Gaza, from the Qassam brigades, Saraya al-Quds, or other resistance forces toward Israel, that the United States would guarantee the ceasefire so that negotiations could continue even beyond 60 days to reach a permanent end to this war and a full withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces. That was a central red line that Hamas staked out in these discussions. But also, Hamas was told by Trump's envoy that Donald Trump himself would personally announce the ceasefire agreement and say that he's committed to it becoming a permanent ceasefire, that Steve Witkoff would preside officially over the late stage negotiations and would sign the deal himself as a guarantor, and that Witkoff would personally shake hands with Dr. Khalil al-Hayya, who is the lead negotiator for Hamas. Hamas doesn't, there is no way to enforce a ceasefire if the United States doesn't want it enforced. Let's just be clear here. The only human being on earth that can force Israel to do anything right now is Donald Trump. So Hamas tried to get what it could, recognizing that none of this is a surefire guarantee, but they felt that if this is so publicly stamped with approval by Donald Trump and his envoys, that it was the best deal that they could get. And from their perspective, they made concessions because there's risk here for them in signing up for a 60-day. They wanted a 90-day initial ceasefire period. The Americans were saying maybe we can get 70. And in the end, Hamas told me we've agreed to 60 days. they've discussed the release of every single Palestinian from Gaza who has been kidnapped or taken prisoner by Israel. And then they would also be looking at what they call the impossibles, high-value Palestinians who are from political resistance movements that have been held, some of them for many decades, by Israel. So Hamas thinks, okay, well, we've been told now that we have an understanding. We understand that Israel is probably going to, put forward amendments or isn't going to like this. But the U.S. is saying, Hamas, you have met the terms that we laid out. Well, before this even sort of hit major publications. I mean, we had reported it very early on because we have sources in the Palestinian negotiating team. Once it sort of, the clock starts moving, Israeli media start reporting that Israel has rejected the deal. Like they hadn't even, the ink wasn't even fresh on the communications to Israel. And Netanyahu and Dermer start telling Hebrew language media, this is a dead deal. This is a Hamas plan. So we watched then and said, okay, this is going to be interesting. What is Witkoff going to say? Well, Israeli journalist who works for Axios and a former member of Israel's security apparatus, Barak Ravid, gets Steve Witkoff, and Witkoff basically says, no, this isn't right, and we're very disappointed in Hamas. So, this was a pattern that played out a lot under Joe Biden's administration as well, where, Blinken or others would give assurances to the regional mediators. They weren't doing direct talks with Hamas, and they would say, okay, if you can agree to this, the U.S. is going to get Israel, to the table. That's what happened in May and June of 2024. And then when Israel blows the deal up, U.S. officials come out and they blame Hamas. By all accounts, what Hamas believed it was doing was making compromises at the request of the United States that it felt it could make without reasonably, not just surrendering itself, surrendering the Palestinian cause for statehood, for freedom, for self-determination. And I think they were a bit blindsided by how this played out, because Witkoff has been slowly morphing into Antony Blinken and his tactics. And so at the end of the day, everyone involved knows the only factor that matters here is if Donald Trump is going to force, in the words of one Palestinian connected to the negotiations, force a ceasefire down Netanyahu's throat. Because I'll tell you this much, Hamas is not going to surrender in the way that Israel is demanding. Hamas is not going to accept terms that don't have a clear framework for a permanent end to the genocide and a removal of all occupation forces. In a way, Israel is in the corner right now because Hamas isn't going to budge on those. And I think that Trump, we have indications for his own reasons. I do think that Trump actually wants this to wrap up. The question is if he's going to be willing to really go to battle against the Israelis to do that, or he lets Gaza burn for another few weeks or a month before we start hearing about this again. It's sick. It's the situation that Palestinians are in is sick right now, because the best hope for a ceasefire is Donald Trump decides it's bad for business to have this war keep going. It's not about saving Palestinian lives at all.
Yeah, and you have, like you said, Germany coming out and saying, okay, this is maybe not going so wonderfully, and we can't exactly support the increasing amount of death. And there's the cynical well, where have you been the last 19 months? Well, on the other hand, like you said, there's the diplomatic support around the world for this effort is rapidly collapsing. Europe is their kind of second last holdout, with the United States being the last holdout. And with indications that Trump wants it to end, what does Netanyahu have left? Like, if let's say he wanted to push ahead against, so okay, 20% of your trade is with Europe, but let's say they feel like they can patch this up and Europe will come back in the fold eventually, and that let's say Trump doesn't want the war to keep going, but he's not going to invest any capital in stopping it. How long under those circumstances, with international illegitimacy increasing, do you think that Netanyahu could sustain this level of carnage, like this increased level of carnage, which is drawing new attention every day?
I mean, it's one of the $6 million questions in this equation, and I think we got a little hint of that with the remarks that you and I have discussed before on this stream. made by both Netanyahu and Smotrich about why they're going to allow some token amounts of aid in. And in addition to saying that, that this is sort of insurance against the Hague or other things, I actually think Israel doesn't really so much care about that. But Netanyahu himself said that he had been hearing even from staunch allies of Israel among the Republican caucus in the Senate, powerful Republican senators who are going along with Trump's politics, but are more from a neocon background. I think that what Netanyahu is trying to do is shore up support from the really hardcore Zionist faction of Trump world. You have people like Miriam Adelson also, who was the premier bankroller of Trump's reelection campaign this cycle. You have Mike Huckabee, who is a fanatical Christian Zionist as the ambassador right now. The administration is chock full of these kinds of people. So I think what Netanyahu feels he has is major multi-decade long allies of Israel's war of annihilation, and we'll try to get them to put pressure on Trump, just incrementally back off, give Israel a bit more time. He just needs to soften Hamas more by pummeling Gaza and going to war against Gaza. I'm sure that there are debates within Trump world about this, and clearly Trump, and our reporting indicates that Trump actually said this when he was visiting Gulf countries, that he gave Netanyahu 2 months to try to achieve his objectives. And now those 2 months have wrapped up. Why do I say 2 months? Because Israel blew up the ceasefire deal on March 1st. It was supposed to go into a second phase. Netanyahu walks away from it, imposes the siege blockade March 2nd, and on March 18th begins a massive campaign of terror bombing that has endured to this very second, burning children and others alive, bombing people who are civil employees of the Hamas government and saying, oh, we've taken out a Hamas person, murdering more journalists, including Hassan Aslaya, one of the most famous and important journalists, Palestinian journalists in Gaza. They murdered him, assassinated him while he was in a hospital recovering from a previous attempt to assassinate him. So I think that what Netanyahu is doing right now is banking on the hardest of the hard right in his coalition and in Trump world to back him to keep stretching this along. I think, though, that there's an awareness in the room that there is a clock now. And the question is, when's Trump going to call the time? Is he going to do it as he indicated this week? Because that's what Trump said on early Monday morning. He said he thinks we're there and we're close. I would look for a real propaganda campaign to portray Hamas as obstructionist, when everyone involved with this process, including the Trump administration, understand quite clearly that Netanyahu wants to just continue this war, continue to burn it down. And I think he's sincere when he says he wants to implement what he calls the Trump plan, which is actually Netanyahu's lifelong goal, which is to erase Palestinians from Palestine.
And there's no shortage, like you said, of the kind of hardcore Zionist faction within the Trump administration, but there are fewer than there were today.
That's true.
Over last week. We reported on Merev Sarin, who was served previously in the Israeli Ministry of Defense and was overseeing the National Security Council's file for both Israel and Iran. She was purged over the weekend. Her boss was purged over the weekend, as were a significant number of others who were in that faction. I saw Kurt Mills, who's the editor-in-chief of the American Conservative, saying that an administration that was running scared of Netanyahu would simply never have made moves like this, like a purge of Netanyahu loyalists, inside the administration. So again,
remember before this, Mike Waltz, also the national security advisor.
These are Waltz people. Yeah.
This is a flashback to also remember, Trump really hates John Bolton, for instance, who was in his, first administration and, then routinely denounced him then as like just a bloodthirsty warmonger. I mean, I think some of the liberal knee-jerk reaction to Trump that I think it does a disservice, because I do think that there are layers of Trump's perspective, and Trump's coalition does in fact include unorthodox thinkers. We can dig up all kinds of horrible things about everyone in the Trump administration. That's true. But on certain issues, there is a tension with the conventional empire thinking, the neocon thinking. That's not the dominant strand of Trump world, but it's there. And that's why I think you're seeing some of these shakeups, because Trump has, he doesn't seem to like what he perceives to be the kind of Dick and Liz Cheney wing of the Republican Party. And it might even be for his own political reasons, but it's real. It does exist.
Yeah. And the thing that got him angry about Waltz and apparently led to his firing, and then because he didn't want to look like he was giving in to the media, he sends him over to the United Nations, was that Waltz was negotiating very closely, talking very closely with Dermer, in particular, Ron Dermer, and Netanyahu's lieutenant, and also Netanyahu himself, about plans for striking Iran's nuclear facilities. And when that emerged, that was a line for Trump. Like, who do you work for, them or for us? So it wouldn't be surprising that several weeks later, all of his deputies, his kind of core leadership at the NSC, are purged as well. Internally, among the kind of doves or isolationists or whatever you want to call them, they had taken to calling the National Security Council the Neocon Security Council. It was this kind of dug-in element that was constantly trying to complicate questions if they were leaning towards not going to war or pushing for war in cases where there might be a neutral position. So it's interesting timing that this purge happened over this exact same weekend. So
remember too, just to say, Trump just did this tour of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and these were extraordinary.
Conspicuously refused to stop in Israel despite an invitation.
And he didn't stop in Israel. And then you had J.D. Vance was supposed to be in Israel, and then that trip got canceled. And Vance tried to kind of play it off as he can't, he didn't want to subject his kids to all this kind of travel. But clearly something is going on there. It may be that it's exaggerated. I mean, we certainly saw that under Biden. I think some of that is true, but there is something real happening, particularly around Iran. Netanyahu does not like what he sees coming from Trump. And I think that while Netanyahu, I think, officially views the Abraham Accords as a positive, that he wants Arab countries to quote unquote normalize relations with Israel, they know that Trump is a wild card. And so, Trump's sitting there with the Emir of Qatar, with other officials from Qatar, with Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, MBZ in the United Arab Emirates. It's not just that Trump's making business deals, quote unquote, for America. It's that Trump's also making business deals for Trumpland, for his family, for his companies, et cetera. And if there's one thing that we know for certain about Trump, his money is his most important, priority. So Netanyahu, in some ways, is running up against Trump the grifter, Trump the con man, Trump the businessman, Trump the narcissist. And I keep saying this, and I think it's really true, that the best chance we have for the Gaza war to be brought to an end is that Trump just decides it's against his family and political business interests.
Yeah. Last thing for people before we wrap this up. I don't know if you even saw this Guardian story, this update to the leak probe at the Department of Defense. Just incredible series of events here for people who didn't follow. So, if you remember, Pete Hegseth frog marched like 3 people out of the Department of Defense, accusing them of having leaked classified information about Panama and some other, kind of sideline issues. The Guardian has an incredible story that lays out what has happened since then. Hegseth and his chief of staff, or buddies, had their own kind of personal lawyer, working in the Pentagon. They tasked this guy with overseeing this leak investigation, who's still managing clients who are suing the Department of Defense, or who are in open legal contests with the Department of Defense. So he is at the same time running leak investigations. He's doing cross-examining members of the Pentagon. It's absolutely remarkable situation. In terms of the White House, sees Dan Caldwell, one of the people who was fired, go on Tucker Carlson and deny that he had anything to do with leaking anything, which is an extremely unusually public thing for somebody to do who would have been involved in leaking. And so people in the White House are like, that's weird. Like, if this guy leaked, he's not going on Tucker Carlson and saying he didn't, because we're the United States government. We'll figure out if he did. So then they go to the Pentagon and say, what's your evidence that these guys did anything? And the Pentagon comes back and says, we have illegal NSA wiretaps that prove it. And the White House, excuse me, you have what? And then he said, well, that's just a rumor I heard. We don't actually have any illegal NSA wiretaps. And now the White House again, it's like, so have you been illegally wiretapping Pentagon officials or have you not? And if you have, that's a worse scandal than leaking some documents about Panama. If you haven't, the fact that you're lying about that to us makes us wonder what kind of a clown car is circling around the Pentagon here. This is utterly preposterous. Meanwhile, you have, Hegseth is no longer allowed to hire his own staff. He's Susie Wiles and others are like inserting people in there. So it sounds like the entire leak investigation has collapsed amid the weight of its own absurdity. And whether or not the NSA was illegally wiretapping Pentagon officials is now an open question. It seems like most logically they were just making that up, that they weren't actually, that the NSA didn't actually do that, but maybe they were, and I don't know. We'll find out.
I mean, we're only a couple months into, or a few months into, the Trump administration, and what we already know is disturbing enough about some of their communication practices, where they were using this Israeli-linked app, not actually Signal, to engage in, Signal chats, and and that of course came out,
was immediately hacked, and
and I also to bring it back to the Israel situation. I mean, remember that Israel has multiple times engaged in espionage operations inside of the United States, some of which, like Jonathan Pollard, came to public light. But much of it, I think, just goes, completely under the radar. There was this interesting nugget in the reporting that we did about the Edon Alexander negotiations, where it was clear that Israel had found out about this by their own spy agencies doing surveillance. And the assumption is that they're spying on Hamas. I wouldn't be in the least bit shocked if Israel is spying on and intercepting the communications of the highest levels of the Trump administration. I mean, this is classic from the Israeli playbook. And if Israel is doing that, a so-called ally of the United States, that people that are, or nations that are classified as adversaries, are also doing this. So there these types of scandals, and what we also know from the Edward Snowden reporting is that you don't even necessarily need to be actively surveilling someone, that often the government is downloading data, whether it's audio or video or texts or what have you, and they use it essentially as a time machine to go back and say, wait a minute, this person's now on our radar, we're going to go back. And there's something in law enforcement called parallel construction, where you can't prove your case legitimately. And so, you take fruit of the poisonous tree, stuff you're not supposed to have, and then you find a way to assemble a parallel way of proving that same thing. That also might be part of what is at play here. But
the Pentagon case seems like it might actually just be parallel fabrication.
Or they're just lying, right?
We don't have any evidence, but trust us, the NSA has it. It's like, wait, NSA? Oh, wait, did we say NSA? Never mind. We didn't do that.
But before we go, Ryan, I do want to tell people, I know some people have complicated feelings about X or about Twitter, but I just want to say how proud I am of the team of people that we have managing our feed on X or Twitter. I mean, yes, it's a total hell site in so many ways, but I really do think it is the best newswire service, particularly on Gaza, but we cover a range of issues. So, if you're not on X and you're looking for an excuse to get on it, do it just to, subscribe to DropSite's Twitter feed, because it's Herman Gill is the guy running it for us, and he's just really a brilliant, extraordinary character, and basically just is working around the clock. And it's the first thing I do in the morning is look at our Twitter feed, because it's that good.
Yeah, just follow that and nothing else. And because the big problem with Twitter is that it has collapsed as a valuable source of real-time news, because it's just filled with engagement slop. And
it is, but journalists and people in Gaza use it, and it's true of a lot of countries. I mean, I don't particularly like it, but it's reality is reality, and for following on the ground in Gaza, there isn't another social platform that presents voices in that way. Yes, it's on Instagram and other things, but people use Twitter, and it's a very, very reliable source of information from Gaza.
I second that endorsement. Jeremy, thank you so much for doing this morning. Again, it's dropsitenews.com. We are I said earlier, we're a nonprofit. We're fiscally sponsored by a nonprofit, so contributions to Dropsite News are tax deductible to the fullest extent of the law, and they are the thing that allow us to make sure that our journalism is free for everybody. Our newsletter is also free. Sign up for that at dropsitenews.com on behalf of Jeremy, myself, and all of our colleagues at Dropsite. Thank you so much.